Hi there. I'm Emma Harper, and this is a story that starts with something as simple as dinner but ends up unraveling years of buried resentment, pride, and family dynamics. If you've ever felt invisible at a family gathering, or maybe you're just curious about how a burnt piece of chicken can silence an entire table, then buckle up because this one's for you. But before we dive in, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any part of this roller coaster ride. Trust me, by the end you'll want to hear it all. It was a crisp autumn evening in Boston when I invited my brother Marcus, his wife Julia, and their daughter Lila to dinner at the Willow Grove, a fancy restaurant tucked away on Newbury Street. The place had glowing reviews, soft jazz playing in the background, and waitstaff who moved like they were auditioning for a ballet. I thought it would be the perfect setting to reconnect with my brother after months of barely exchanging texts. My daughter Sophie, who was 8, tagged along, clutching her sketchbook like it was her lifeline. She always did that, drew her way through awkward silences or uncomfortable moments. Little did I know, those sketches would become the voice she needed later that night. As soon as we walked into the restaurant, I could feel the undercurrent of tension between me and Julia. She swept in wearing a tailored navy dress, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like punctuation marks. "Emma," she said, air-kissing me without actually touching my cheek. "This place looks quaint." Quaint. That was Julia speak for, not as luxurious as I'd hoped. Meanwhile, Marcus slapped me on the back and joked about how he couldn't remember the last time I treated them to anything this fancy. Sophie stayed quiet, tugging at the hem of her sweater while Lila, my 10-year-old niece, held court. "I read somewhere that the chef here trained in Paris," Lila announced, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "So I expect perfection." Julia beamed proudly, nodding as if Lila had just solved world hunger. It wasn't lost on me how Sophie shrank further into herself, doodling absent-mindedly on the menu. Something inside me tightened, but I forced a smile and steered the conversation toward safer topics, like the weather. We settled into our seats by the window, where strings of fairy lights twinkled outside like fireflies. The waiter arrived, pad in hand, ready to take our orders. Lila ordered first, naturally. "Filet mignon medium rare," she declared, adding, "and make sure it's cooked perfectly." Marcus chuckled indulgently while Julia gave the waiter a pointed look that screamed, "Don't mess this up." Sophie hesitated, glancing at the menu like it might bite her. Finally, she murmured, "Can I have the grilled chicken breast?" Her voice was so soft I almost missed it. "Grilled chicken? Really?" Julia raised an eyebrow as though Sophie had chosen mud pie instead of dessert. "Lila prefers steak because it's more refined." Refined. There was that word again. I wanted to tell Julia that Sophie wasn't trying to compete with Lila, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I smiled at Sophie and said, "That sounds delicious, sweetheart." She nodded, though her eyes stayed glued to her napkin, where she'd started sketching a flower. When the food finally arrived, the table fell silent, for about 2 seconds. Lila's steak was plated like a work of art, the pink center glistening under the warm light. Julia clapped her hands lightly, saying, "Now that is what I call dinner." Meanwhile, Sophie's plate looked like it had been scorched in a fire. The chicken was charred black on one side, dry and unappetizing. My stomach dropped. I glanced at Sophie, whose face flushed red as she stared at her plate. "Excuse me," I said to the waiter who hovered nearby. "There seems to be a problem with this dish." He apologized profusely, promising to fix it immediately. But Julia waved him off. "Oh, it's fine," she said breezily. "Kids are resilient. They'll eat anything." Resilient? Was she serious right now? Sophie didn't say a word, but I saw her shoulders slump even lower. And then I noticed her grip tighten around her fork. I tried to smooth things over, telling Sophie it would only take a few minutes to get her a new plate. But she shook her head and whispered, "It's okay, Mom. I'll eat it." Part of me wanted to insist, but another part knew arguing would only draw more attention to the situation. So I let it slide, hoping the rest of the meal would pass without incident. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Julia kept praising Lila's choice of steak, going on about how discerning she was and how proud they were of her sophisticated palate. Every word felt like a jab aimed directly at Sophie, who sat quietly, picking at her burnt chicken. Marcus chimed in too, laughing about how Lila inherited her taste buds from him. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Sophie didn't cry though. She just kept eating, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was swallowing not just the food but also every ounce of humiliation. By the time dessert rolled around, the atmosphere at the table was thick with unspoken tension. Sophie hadn't touched her chocolate mousse, and Lila was busy describing her upcoming piano recital in excruciating detail. That's when Sophie finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but steady, cutting through the chatter like a knife. "You know," she began, looking straight at Julia, "just because someone doesn't like fancy things doesn't mean they're less important." The room froze. Forks paused midair and everyone turned to stare at her. Even the waiter, who had returned with fresh water glasses, stopped moving. Sophie continued, her gaze unwavering. "Sometimes people act like being refined makes you better than others. But it doesn't. What matters is how you treat people, not what you order for dinner." For a moment no one said anything. The silence stretched out like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. Julia blinked rapidly, clearly unsure whether to laugh it off or defend herself. Marcus cleared his throat, glancing nervously between Sophie and me. Lila, for once, seemed speechless, her mouth slightly open as if she'd been caught off guard. I reached across the table and squeezed Sophie's hand, pride swelling in my chest. She'd said exactly what I'd been thinking, but hadn't dared to voice. And suddenly I realized this wasn't just about dinner anymore. This was about years of feeling overlooked, dismissed, and overshadowed by Marcus and Julia's relentless pursuit of perfection. The waiter broke the spell by asking if anyone wanted coffee, but the damage was done. The table would never be the same again. On the drive home, Sophie sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, my mind replaying her words at the restaurant. "What matters is how you treat people, not what you order for dinner." It was such a simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of unspoken frustration. When we got home, I tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead. "You were very brave tonight," I told her softly. She shrugged, pulling her stuffed rabbit closer. "I just didn't want them to think I don't matter," she whispered. My heart broke a little hearing that. I wanted to tell her she mattered more than anything in the world, but instead I promised her we'd figure out a way to make sure everyone understood that. Later that night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, staring at the half-empty mug like it held all the answers. Sophie's comment had stirred something deep inside me, memories of family dinners growing up, where Marcus always seemed to shine while I faded into the background. Back then I convinced myself it didn't matter. But now, seeing Sophie go through the same thing, I realized how much it still hurt. I thought about Julia's dismissive remarks, Marcus's subtle jabs, and the way they put Lila on a pedestal. They weren't bad people, they just didn't notice the impact of their actions. Or maybe they did and they simply didn't care. Either way, it was time to address it head-on. An idea began forming in my mind. A family dinner at my house where Sophie could truly shine. This time I'd set the stage, not Julia. The next day, Sophie came home from school buzzing with excitement. "Mom, guess what?" she said, dropping her backpack by the door. Before I could answer, she pulled out a colorful booklet she'd been working on during recess. "It's called Family Dinners. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly," she announced proudly. Each page featured illustrations of our past gatherings. Some funny, some sweet, and some painfully honest. One drawing showed Lila posing dramatically with her steak at the Willow Grove, while another depicted Sophie shrinking into her chair beside a plate of burnt chicken. There was even a picture of me looking uncomfortable as Julia smirked across the table. "This is amazing, Soph," I said, flipping through the pages. "But why are you doing this?" He grinned. "Because I want them to see what it feels like to be me." With Sophie's blessing, I sent out invitations for a family dinner at my place the following weekend. I made sure to keep things casual. No fancy menus or over-the-top decorations. Instead, I focused on creating an environment where Sophie's creativity could take center stage. I baked her favorite lasagna, arranged fresh flowers in mismatched vases, and hung string lights around the dining room to give it a cozy vibe. When Marcus texted asking if he should bring wine, I replied with a firm no. "This isn't about impressing anyone," I wrote. "Just come ready to connect." He responded with a thumbs-up emoji, though I could practically hear his skepticism through the screen. So I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this dinner could change things. The evening of the dinner arrived and my small apartment buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus and Julia walked in first, carrying a bottle of champagne despite my request. We figured you'd need something to liven things up, Marcus joked, popping the cork before I could protest. Lila followed behind them, scrolling through her phone without so much as a hello. Sophie greeted everyone warmly, clutching her illustrated book tightly. As we sat down to eat, I noticed Julia eyeing the mismatched chairs and hand-painted plates with thinly veiled disdain. Quaint, she remarked again, though this time it sounded sharper. I ignored her, focusing instead on serving the lasagna and encouraging everyone to dig in. True to form, Julia wasted no time turning the conversation toward her latest renovation project, a sprawling penthouse downtown complete with marble countertops and gold fixtures. It's all about creating spaces that reflect your personality, she explained, gesturing animatedly with her fork. Of course, not everyone has the vision or the budget for that. Marcus laughed awkwardly, clearly trying to lighten the mood. Well, you've certainly got character here, he said, looking around the room. His tone suggested he meant it as a compliment, but it landed like a backhanded slap. I forced a smile, reminding myself why we were here. This wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about giving Sophie a voice. After dessert, a homemade apple crisp, I stood up and tapped my glass lightly with a spoon. Before we finish, there's something I'd like to share, I said, nodding toward Sophie. She hesitated for a moment, then stood beside me, holding her booklet close. This is a story about us, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She flipped to the first page, showing a cheerful illustration of our childhood Christmases. These are the good times, she said. Then she turned to a darker image of herself sitting alone at a table, overshadowed by Lila's glowing presence. And these are the bad ones. By the time she reached the final page, a hopeful scene of our family laughing together, I saw tears glistening in Marcus's eyes. Sophie closed her book and looked directly at Marcus and Julia. I know Lila is really smart and talented, but sometimes it feels like nobody sees me, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not trying to compete with her. I just want to be enough. The room fell silent once more, but this time it felt different, like the air had shifted. Marcus leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Sophie, he said finally, I had no idea you felt that way. Julia, usually so composed, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. For the first time I saw cracks in her polished facade. Marcus cleared his throat and stood up, pulling Sophie into a tight hug. I'm sorry, kiddo, he said gruffly. We've been selfish, haven't we? Always bragging about Lila and forgetting how special you are. Lila, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, added, I didn't mean to make you feel bad, Sophie. You're awesome at drawing and lots of other stuff too. Julia nodded, her usual confidence replaced by genuine remorse. You're right, Sophie, she admitted. We've been so focused on appearances that we forgot what really matters. That stops now. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I watched my family begin to heal, even if only a little. As the night wound down, the atmosphere shifted from tension to warmth. We lingered at the table, sharing stories and laughter long after the dishes were cleared. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly connecting, not competing. When Marcus and Julia left, Marcus hugged me tightly and whispered, Thanks for calling us out. We needed that. Back inside, Sophie curled up on the couch with her sketchbook, already brainstorming ideas for her next project. Watching her, I realized this dinner wasn't just about fixing old wounds. It was about building a future where everyone felt seen and valued. The days following the dinner felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from all of us. Sophie was unusually chipper, humming tunes while she sketched and even volunteering to help me clean up after meals, a first in her 8 years. I could tell that having her voice heard, really heard, had done wonders for her confidence. Meanwhile, Marcus called me twice in 1 week, something he hadn't done in months, to check in on how things were going. Even Julia sent a text saying, I've been thinking about what Sophie said. You're raising an incredible girl. But as much as I wanted to bask in the newfound warmth, I knew this was just the beginning. Healing doesn't happen overnight, especially when old habits run deep. Still, there was a sense of hope lingering in the air, a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, we were moving toward something better. One afternoon, while tidying up Sophie's room, I stumbled upon a new sketchbook she'd started. The cover read My Voice Matters in bold letters, surrounded by tiny drawings of flowers and stars. Inside, each page told a different story, some funny, some poignant, all reflections of her inner world. One particularly striking illustration showed two girls standing side by side, one holding a paintbrush, the other a trophy. Beneath it, Sophie had written, "Different gifts, same value." I sat down on her bed, flipping through the pages with a mix of awe and pride. When Sophie walked in, catching me mid-page, she didn't snatch the book away or blush with embarrassment. Instead, she smiled shyly and said, "It helps me figure out my feelings." I pulled her into a hug, whispering, "Your art is amazing, sophomore. Never stop sharing it with the world." A few weeks later, Julia surprised me by showing up at my door unannounced. She carried a small potted plant, a peace offering perhaps, and looked almost nervous as she stepped inside. "Can we talk?" she asked, twisting the strap of her designer handbag. We sat at the kitchen table where the faint scent of coffee still lingered. After a long pause, Julia sighed and said, "I owe you an apology. For years I've treated you like you weren't measuring up." But seeing Sophie stand up for herself made me realize how unfair that was. "You've been doing an incredible job as a mom, Emma. And I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." Her words caught me off guard, but they also felt genuine. For the first time, I saw Julia not as the polished, judgmental sister-in-law I'd resented, but as someone who, like me, was just trying to navigate life the best way she knew how. With tensions easing, Marcus suggested we make family dinners a regular thing, not always at fancy restaurants or lavish homes but wherever felt right. Our next gathering was at his penthouse, though this time the focus wasn't on perfection. Instead, we played board games, laughed until our sides hurt, and let Sophie teach everyone how to draw cartoon portraits. Even Lila joined in, surprising us all by admitting she admired Sophie's creativity. "I wish I could draw like that," she confessed during a game of charades. Sophie grinned and handed her a pencil. "Here, I'll show you." By the end of the night, Lila had sketched a hilariously lopsided cat, which earned thunderous applause from the adults. As weeks turned into months, the changes within our family became undeniable. Conversations flowed more easily without the usual undertones of competition or criticism. Sophie blossomed, gaining confidence not just in her art but in speaking her mind. At school, she entered an art contest and won first prize for her illustrated booklet about family dynamics, a project inspired by that fateful dinner at the Willow Grove. When the award ceremony rolled around, Marcus, Julia, and Lila showed up in full support, cheering louder than anyone else in the auditorium. As Sophie accepted her certificate, beaming with pride, I realized that this moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to all of us. It was proof that honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to listen could transform even the most fractured relationships. Walking into Sophie's art exhibition at school felt surreal. Her work lined the walls, each piece telling a story of resilience, identity, and connection. There was the burnt chicken plate reimagined as a mosaic of broken tiles coming together, symbolizing healing. Another piece depicted a tree growing between two houses, its branches intertwining, a metaphor for our family finding common ground. Marcus stood beside me, gazing at the tree painting with misty eyes. "She's got talent, Em," he said softly. "Real talent." Julia nodded, snapping photos to post on social media, not to brag but to celebrate. For the first time, I didn't feel overshadowed or dismissed. We were a team, united in our admiration for Sophie's brilliance. At the end of the exhibition, Sophie gave a short speech to the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began, clutching the microphone like it might slip away. "This project started because I wanted people to understand how it feels to be invisible. But now, thanks to my family, I know I'm not invisible anymore. And neither are any of you." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and judging by the sniffles around the room, I wasn't alone. As the applause erupted, I glanced at Marcus, Julia, and Lila, feeling a surge of gratitude. This journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought us closer than ever before. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, I found myself reflecting on everything we'd been through. From the burnt chicken at the Willow Grove to the standing ovation at her art exhibition, it had been a whirlwind of emotions. But more than anything, it had been a lesson in courage. The kind of courage it takes to speak your truth even when your voice shakes. "Mom," Sophie whispered sleepily. "Do you think Aunt Julia will ever stop being fancy?" I chuckled, smoothing her hair. "Probably not," I replied. "But that's okay. What matters is that she, and everyone else, sees you for who you truly are, a bright, brave, and talented little artist. As I turned off the light, I made a silent vow to cherish these moments, to keep nurturing the bonds we'd worked so hard to rebuild. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection or appearances. It's about showing up, for the good, the bad, and everything in between. And with that, dear reader, our story comes to a close. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share it with someone who might need a reminder that their voice matters too. Until next time.